He could silence a room without saying a word. A heavy stance, a bolted neck, a dead stare under studio lights, that was enough. That was Frankenstein's monster, and for a generation of moviegoers, that face belonged to one man. But strip away the makeup, the boots, the 6 guns, and the bartender's apron, and you find someone almost nobody knew. A quiet rancher, a fiddle player, a man who loved children and hated confrontation. The irony sits at the center of his whole life. The actor who frightened millions was, by every account, one of the gentlest men in Hollywood. So who was he really? A horror icon? An underrated character actor? Or a man who spent 4 decades standing in the shadow of roles that were never truly his own? To understand him, you have to go back before Hollywood existed for him at all, back to the dust, the cattle, and the wide-open silence of the American West. He was born in 1899 in a small settlement in the New Mexico Territory, more than 10 years before that land would even become a state. His given name carried the weight of family tradition, but the world he was born into had nothing to do with fame. His father worked cattle. His mother came from a bloodline that, according to some family accounts, stretched back through generations to early American frontier history. None of that mattered on a working ranch. What mattered was labor. By the time his family relocated to rural Texas, his childhood had already been shaped by 2 things: animals and language. He grew up speaking his family's native tongue at home, and he grew up on horseback before he grew up in a classroom. School did not last long. His father believed an 8th grade education was more than enough for a boy who was going to spend his life on a ranch, so he left the classroom behind as a teenager and never looked back. Work replaced homework. Cattle replaced classmates. There was no golden path laid out for him, no mentor waiting in the wings, no early sign that his name would ever mean anything beyond the boundaries of that ranch. He simply did what was expected of a boy in that world he worked. He obeyed, and he grew up faster than most children ever have to. And somewhere in the middle of that hard, repetitive labor, something unexpected took root: music. Around age 12, he taught himself the fiddle simply by listening and repeating. The guitar came soon after. He started playing at local dances, small stages, nothing glamorous but real. By his 20s, he was performing with a touring cowboy band, appearing on regional radio broadcasts, earning a small reputation as a working musician long before anyone in Hollywood knew his name. But music alone didn't pay the bills. And neither did ranching, not always. So he tried other things. He boxed for a stretch, even stepping into the ring against a genuinely famous heavyweight, a fight that left him with a permanently misshapen ear as a souvenir. He carried a badge for a while too, working as a deputy and later as a small-town police officer. By his late 20s, he had already lived more lives than most people manage in 60 years: cowboy, musician, boxer, lawman. None of those lives were leading toward a film career. Then an accident changed everything. He entered a rodeo organized by a well-known Western film star of the era. During the competition, a horse came down on top of him. It should have been just another painful footnote in a hard life. Instead, the injury led to a friendship. The film star helped him afterward. The 2 men grew close, and through that unlikely connection, doors that had never existed before suddenly opened. Hollywood did not find him in an acting class. It found him in a dirt arena, after a horse had already tried to put him in the ground. What made this path different from so many other Western actors of the era was simple: he never had to fake anything. Other actors learned to ride for the camera. He had been writing since before he could read. The world Hollywood was busy inventing on soundstages was a world he had actually lived in. When he arrived in the film industry in the early 1930s, there was no red carpet waiting. He wasn't trained, polished, or sought after. He was simply useful. His earliest work barely qualifies as acting. He filled space, drove wagons, wrangled horses, played nameless gunmen who appeared for a few seconds and vanished. The industry at the time was churning out cheap Western films at breakneck speed for small-town theaters, and that machine needed bodies who could actually perform the physical work a Western demanded. He fit that need perfectly. Directors didn't have to teach him to ride, rope, or handle a wagon team skills. He'd already spent a lifetime mastering on real ranches. His earliest credited appearance of note came in a multi-chapter serial alongside a young actor still trying to find his footing, a man who would later become one of the biggest stars in film history. His own role was tiny, but it put him inside bigger productions than the local westerns he'd been grinding through. Over the next several years, he kept working, kept appearing, kept being the reliable face nobody quite remembered by name. Some of his roles weren't even credited. Audiences saw him constantly. They just didn't know who him was. By the mid-1930s, the pattern was set. He'd appear in a serial here, an uncredited bit there, cowhands and outlaws and men who stood in the way of the hero. And slowly, his screen persona shifted. The singing cowboy roles faded. His towering height, his broad frame, his sharply angled face, all of it made him a natural fit for villains, gunmen, henchmen, men the hero had to beat. By the end of the decade, he was getting more screen time, working steadily across multiple small studios. He wasn't famous, but he was dependable, and in the low-budget factory of B-Westerns, dependable was worth more than star power. The 1940 seconds cranked the pace up even further. Studios built entirely around cheap, fast westerns needed actors who could show up, hit their mark, and move to the next set without complaint. In some years, he appeared in more than 10 separate productions, jumping from one dusty backlot to another with barely a day between them. Audiences who loved the genre had almost certainly seen his face dozens of times without ever learning his name. He played sheriffs, outlaws, and men who ran whole corrupt towns. Directors trusted him with more screen time now, not because his name sold tickets, but because they knew exactly what they'd get: a professional who understood the rhythm of a western set better than almost anyone else working in it. He had, without anyone officially declaring it, become one of the most recognizable unrecognized faces of the entire western genre. Few outside the industry could have named him. Almost everyone inside it knew exactly who to call when a script needed a certain kind of face. Here is the strange part. Nobody expected the moment that was coming. For over a decade, he'd been defined by horses and gunfights. Then, in 1943, a handful of low-budget mystery and horror pictures pulled him toward a completely different studio and toward a completely different kind of fame. While working at that studio, he caught the attention of the makeup artist responsible for creating some of the most iconic monster faces in film history. According to his own later account, the artist studied his face for days before finally asking him to stay after hours for a makeup test. He agreed mostly because of the extra pay. For hours, the artist worked in silence, refusing to let him see the progress. When the mirror was finally uncovered, he didn't recognize himself. He blurted out that he looked exactly like the actor who had originated the role over a decade earlier. The studio was preparing a new monster team-up film and needed someone to carry the Frankenstein look forward. He got the part. It should have been terrifying in the wrong way, following a role that had already become legendary. Every gesture would be compared to his predecessor. But instead of resentment, he received guidance. The original Frankenstein actor spent time with him before filming, talking him through the physicality of the role. Their approaches were completely different. One built the monster through subtlety, small human flickers behind the makeup. The other built it through sheer scale. His height alone changed the character's presence entirely. Years later, the original actor would humbly note that he'd simply had the good fortune of being first. That first film led to a sequel the following year. Then to the film most people remember him for, above everything else, a horror comedy team-up that brought together nearly every classic monster character in one story. It became one of the most beloved films of its kind, still watched and re-watched decades later. On that set, one of the most retold stories in the whole production involved a young child visiting the set, taking one look at him in full monster makeup, and bursting into tears in genuine terror. Everyone laughed about it afterward, because everyone on set already knew the truth. Underneath that face was one of the gentlest people they'd ever worked with. He would call that production one of the most enjoyable experiences of his entire career. Away from the cameras, his life was almost defiantly ordinary. No scandals, no headlines, no repeated public breakups. His first marriage, entered into when he was still a young man far from any film set, ended in divorce, with almost nothing recorded about why. One of the few private chapters he never spoke of publicly. His second marriage lasted more than 3 decades and produced a daughter, and through all the years of constant work across studios and networks, that marriage remained the steady center of his life. He loved hunting, fishing, and cooking, simple pleasures that had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with the man he'd been long before Hollywood found him. Colleagues consistently described him as simple, direct, and completely unlike the towering, threatening characters he so often played on screen. Behind the monster mask and behind the gunslinger's scowl was a man who, by every account, adored children and treated everyone on set with quiet patience, a gentleness that never once made it into the roles he was hired to play. His closest friendship in the industry belonged to another actor from that same era of classic monster films. The two men had bonded on set decades earlier and stayed close for the rest of their lives. Two performers who had watched the industry transform completely, from cheap serials to the golden age of horror to the rise of television. When that friend passed away in the summer of 1973, he was already fighting a serious illness of his own. Weak as he was, he still showed up to say goodbye. And that, in the end, is the whole paradox of his life. He helped create images more famous than his own name ever became. Audiences recognized the monster instantly. Later generations recognized the bartender just as fast. But almost nobody, at the height of either role, could have told you who he actually was. He was never the biggest star of his era. He never won major awards. He was rarely the reason people bought a ticket. But from the ranches of Texas to the rodeo that nearly killed him, from decades of anonymous Western gunmen to one of horror's most reproduced faces, to a saloon in a fictional Kansas town, he built something rare. Not fame in the traditional sense, but presence, endurance. A career defined not by how loudly he was remembered, but by how consistently he showed up. Decades later, when his old films rerun late at night, when his face turns up on a Halloween mask, when someone recognizes the bartender before they recognize the actor, he's still there, still present, still, in the truest sense, the man behind the mask.